Hello, and welcome back to the Let Me Add to That podcast. My name is Elizabeth Graswich, Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We are the largest regional education agency in the United States. We serve 80 school districts and nearly 2 million children. We are excited to use this platform to take a deep dive into the conversations surrounding our students and schools in LA County. Today, we're tackling a really important topic, how we can better support our amazing teachers who are working with English language learners within Los Angeles County high schools. We're going to check out a fascinating study which shines a light on some exciting data and real challenges. The study was made possible by the Sobrato Philanthropies and the Greater Los Angeles Education Foundation. Joining us remotely today, we have Roberta Gonzalez, LACOE's Project Director 3 from the Multilingual Academic Support Unit. Welcome, Roberta.
Thank you so much.
Also joining us is Dr. Laura Hill-Bonnet from Stanford's Center to Support Excellence in Teaching. Welcome, Laura.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad to have you both here today. We want to start off with some basics. Can you first tell us a little bit about multilingual learner research and the paper and what it entails?
Sure. The landscape of multilingual learner or English learner research is vast and wide and certainly have been going on for many years. I think that we've got some good data on what works well for students. I think and I'm speaking nationally, not just in LA County, but I think we've got some good data on the ways that kiddos learn both language and content. And I think we are learning on how to best implement those things in schools across the country. I think that this paper in particular does a deeper dive into some of that data and looks at, okay, well, what do teachers know and how are they able to implement some of those things in their classrooms? And so what we did is we took a mixed methods approach to doing that. We did a larger scale quantitative study with surveys asking teachers what they know about working with English language learners, what they usually do in their classrooms, where they get their support, what resources they have access to, etc. And then we wanted to also make sure that we did a little bit of a deeper dive with some qualitative data and did some interviews with teachers and asked them about their experiences, their day-to-day experiences in their classroom. We also got a chance to talk to a group of kiddos as well to see what works best for them when their teachers are implementing different kinds of strategies in the classroom. And we had just a really insightful conversations with several groups in these qualitative interviews.
Wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit about the findings? What do teachers need to do to provide effective instruction for our English language learners?
Yeah, I think the findings were really, I think that they were very encouraging, but also very telling at the same time. So when we asked teachers what they knew about working with English learners, they had a lot of expertise, which was really encouraging and exciting. I mean, one of the things that we found in our study is that across LA County, y'all have got a really knowledgeable group of teachers, and they're working super hard to support all of their students. They've been in the classroom on the average between 10 and 15 years, and they know a lot about ways to support their students. And so when we asked them the things that they knew about building background knowledge, supporting home languages, working with students with different kinds of supports and things like that, which was all really encouraging. I think what was most interesting to my colleague Preetha, who is my co-author on this study, for she and I, what we found out was when we asked them, okay, awesome, that's great. These are all the things you know how to do, but what do you actually do in your classroom? The numbers dropped dramatically from the things that they knew how to do to what they were actually implementing was a very small subset of those things. So while they knew about, building background knowledge or drawing on first language resources, the things that they were actually doing were much lower level kinds of instructional or pedagogical strategies like using sentence frames and visual aids and maybe some word banks, which are all great things, but it didn't quite get to what they knew about. So then the question became to us, um, well, what do you need to be able to do those things? Like, what's the missing piece? You know what it is, but the question is, well, how does it get implemented? And I think that that's where we had the opportunity to do the deeper dive with the qualitative interviews to ask, hey, what's going on with this?
I think that really shows the strength of studies, right? Roberta, were you going to say something?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that is very clear from the study is that it really does sort of underscore the observations that we are seeing as a county office of ed in our work with LEAs. And so I think one of the things, as Laura mentioned, that I really want to just uplift is this idea that we have a very skilled workforce in terms of our teachers, many of whom are veteran in the very best sense of that term. Um, and it really is about, I think, based on what Laura was sharing, this sense of how can we capitalize on the experience? How can we capitalize on their sort of knowledge base that they have? And how can we tweak some of those structures that we currently have in place to provide teachers with the prime context for being able to really reference, utilize, put into practice that knowledge that they have in service of students. I think one of the great aspects of the work that Laura and Preetha undertook was being able to enhance some of their learning and some of the information from the quantitative part of the study with the qualitative. And it was interesting to hear student perspectives who were very clear in terms of what they felt was in service of them. And perhaps some of those strategies that are go-tos for many of us were perhaps not the most effective from their perspective as a learner. And so I think all of that provides some guidance about how we can, again, make some slight changes in terms of the context we provide for teachers to equip them to really, again, access what they already know and be able to put it in practice in a way that benefits students.
Well, and I love that. So Laura smiled as you mentioned students. So, I mean, I think it goes to we learn from qualitative experiences over and over again that student voice is just such a key.
It's from the mouths of babes is really where the truth is going to happen. They do speak the truth to power. And so when we were asking them, so what do what kinds of things do you enjoy in your classrooms? They all said that they enjoyed when they were provided adequate supports, when they were given opportunities to practice and to try and to fail and then to try again. One of the students that we talked about said, it was just, the teacher was just reading what was going on. And I think that, on the one hand, the generous response to that is that the teacher was providing multiple inputs, levels of input, both visual and oral, but it was still unidirectional. Like it was still the teacher sort of this kind of, banking model of, the teacher telling students what to think or what to read or what to do. And there weren't a lot of opportunities for kids to interact with each other. And that's what they said is like, when I get a chance to talk to my friends, then that's where the magic happens. And I think that, when we talk to teachers, like, okay, so, what kinds of interactional strategies do you use? There wasn't a lot of response to that. So they know a lot of the kinds of supports and strategies for the input. But one of my things that I've been taking away from, even since doing this study is how do we support teachers providing opportunities for students to do the output, to show what they know and to grapple with different topics.
That's so fascinating, Laura. I really, agree with that general premise about how do we create classrooms that are more active and engaging for students. And one of the things I'm really thinking about, from a former teacher lens, is this concept of what it takes to be able to make that happen. And I think one of the recurring concerns and requests that we hear from teachers in the field is the need for time
Oh,
to engage in planning, time to engage in collaboration with colleagues. I think that when you see an amazingly engaging classroom where you have kids that are speaking, where you have kids that are engaging with one another, I mean, all of that to make that happen requires a significant amount of planning and thought and reflection and collaboration. And in order to, be able to do that, it requires time and it requires structures where teachers can engage in that type of really rigorous preparation. And so I think that is definitely one of the pieces of information that is actionable from the white paper, is considering how we create some tweaks within our systems to create these opportunities for teachers to be able to provide classrooms where students are engaging with one another, where they're speaking, where they're really co-creating meaning in a rigorous environment, where they're accessing core content in a way that is benefiting them, now at this point, but also placing them on a trajectory for success in the future in terms of college and or career.
Absolutely. I've been reflecting a lot on that exact thing, Roberta, is providing teachers with opportunities to work together and do some of that do and co-teaching. I think that was one of the things that came across loud and clear in our qualitative data, is they said, oh, I really wanted to do X, Y, and Z, but I don't know how. I'm not sure when. I think that idea of time both outside of the classroom to collaborate with colleagues, but also the time in the classroom to make space for interaction, because interaction is messy. It's loud, it's confusing, it can be scary. Oh my goodness, if your principal walks in and everybody's talking at the same time, it can be, it can be very daunting at times. But I think providing teachers with the opportunity to really engage in those kinds of practices and to, again, build their confidence around them is really key in some of this work.
Well, before we go any further, I want to kind of quantify this. So, we have nearly 2 million students in LA County as it is, which is, a huge number, the largest in the nation. Of those, do we know how many are English learners?
About 17% of those, so just under 20% of those are the total number of English language learners. There's an additional about another 20% who have been reclassified, so are no longer English language learners. So we're looking at just under half of the LA County population having at some point been an English language learner. And then again, there's another proportion of those who are considered what we would call long-term English learners, who have been classified as English learners for more than, I think now, is it 5 or 7 years, Roberta? Somewhere around in there.
It varies depending on the definition.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we are often looking at that 7-year mark in terms of being considered a long-term English learner. That sort of is in line with this general sense that developing language proficiency is something that can, in general, take 5 to 7 years. That is, typically what the trajectory for English language development and proficiency looks like.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the, with that window of 5 to 7 years, I mean, give or take, I think that has been, it's a tricky piece to quantify in schools when time moves so quickly. I think that kiddos have to start taking standardized end of grade testing, within just a year or two of them arriving in the US. They don't have the luxury of those 5 to 7 years to fully develop the proficiency. And particularly when we're starting to look at graduation rates in schools across the state and in LA County, I mean, LA County actually has a pretty good EL graduation rate of about 66.5%, which I think is commendable. But when we start looking at the number of English learners who are meeting the UC and CSU requirements, it drops to about 38%. So that is telling us that there's something that's keeping kiddos from not succeeding in those higher level classes, the calculus classes, the foreign language classes, the AP classes, those kinds of coursework that require a lot more that have a little bit more rigor to them than some of the other classes. And so providing kiddos with opportunities to really engage with the materials in those classes, I think is really important.
Well, and I know I've had some delightful conversations with students recently who are English language learners, and they do talk about like there's so many challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an English language learner in coming to a new country and learning the language and fitting in with friends, and so it makes English language acquisition even so much more important because it's just one more thing that they're dealing with, or if as they adapt and learn, don't have to deal with. And so I know we've been dealing with this for a long time in LA County, so we already have some practices in place, correct? Can you share a little bit about those and how people can now add to them based on what you've learned?
So I think one of the telling pieces that we learned through the study is that we did have an opportunity to talk to a couple of ELD specialists or ELD coaches or TOSIS across the county, and I think that they shared a lot of highlights from their work in the ways that they're able to support both students and teachers in learning language and content. They spoke a lot about what the state refers to as designated ELD, or that consecrated time that's set aside for language learning, and the ways that they're able to support kiddos in that moment. I think where the again, where the magic happens is in those integrated moments, those integrated ELD, where kids and teachers are working on the language of the disciplinary language in a particular content area. So the language of math, the language of science, the language of social studies, and they're doing that in a social studies class or in a science class or in a math class. And I think that one of the challenges, and Roberta spoke to this really eloquently a little bit earlier in our conversation, is the opportunities for language specialists to work with content specialists in tandem. So they're doing double duty in those content classrooms. It's hard. This is a relational business. Like, we are human people interacting with each other. And so, the ELD specialist would say, gosh, I really want to be able to support my content colleagues, but, they're not teaching in tandem and in lockstep. Everybody's doing something different. I feel like I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off, which is, I think, one of the quotes that made it into the paper. And, and on the other end, we talked to some science teachers and math teachers saying, hey, I really want to be able to do these strategies, but things are moving so quickly in my classroom. I don't know how to make it happen. And then I think another piece of that is we talked to a math teacher who had a paraprofessional in her classroom as well. And so I think on the one hand, this teacher was really grateful to have the support of another adult in the room to help orchestrate some of the interactions in her classroom. But at the other end, I'm not sure that paraprofessional was really being used to their greatest capacity. And I think that one of the recommendations, and we can talk about this in a minute, but one of the recommendations is also to provide, some professional learning for paraprofessionals so that we can really leverage their presence in the classroom and bring that level of professionalism to them that we expect from teachers at the same time.
And I think part of what you're sharing, Laura, really speaks to this sort of evolving sense of shared responsibility as it relates to supporting English learners and multilingual learners. And, in 2017, our California State Board of Education adopted the California English Learner Roadmap, which really is a seminal document that really lays out a vision for what we want for our multilingual learners, our English learners here in California. And it really does speak to this sense of shared responsibility, which when we consider that, a bit under half of all students in LA County have been an English learner at some point in their educational career. Like, by definition, we are a multilingual county, and our schools have a multilingual lens. This sense of shared responsibility, it really is sort of a paradigm shift in terms of the course of what California has experienced in the past perhaps couple of decades. but it's an important one, sets California apart, and is definitely something that we see underway. We see educators in our LEAs that are committed to collaborating in new and different ways. And I think that as time goes on, one of the important advances that we are sort of poised to make is having all teachers across content areas conceive of themselves as language instructors, as teachers of English, be it foundational English or academic language within their content area. But I think that's an important shift that's underway, and it's sort of foundational, I think, to all of the work and all of the recommendations that are really highlighted in the white paper.
Circle back to something you touched on before, but I want to highlight it a little more. So this report focuses on high school, and I'm curious about the difference between supporting an English language learner at the high school level versus the elementary level.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think that the context for supporting English learners, it just looks different at an elementary level and at a secondary level. I think at an elementary level with the self-contained classroom, not in all cases, because it really does depend on your LEA demographics, but in many cases, some of that sense of shared responsibility is woven into your role. Oftentimes, a multiple subject teacher in a self-contained classroom is charged with teaching all content areas, inclusive of designated ELD. And so there is this sense of perhaps language teacher, again, woven into your role. I think that's a little different at a secondary level where you really have content experts in each of the different content areas who really are focused on teaching their particular subject area. And then I think the heavy lift for those teachers is to really then consider how to provide the language supports, the language scaffolds, that essential integrated ELD throughout the course of daily instruction. And so I think that it's a different balance perhaps than what we see at an elementary level. Certainly, I think one of the biggest challenges, and as a former elementary teacher and principal, I will say foremost, we do some amazing foundational work at an elementary level. And we, pride ourselves in making content accessible for all students. But I think that lift is even more pronounced at a secondary level where we're really looking at rigor in each of those content areas being significantly amped up such that it can be a real challenge, and it requires tremendous skill to be able to make that content accessible for students in a way where you're maintaining rigor while still promoting access.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing, Roberta. I will add that I think the added challenge at the high school level is coordination and communication. So when when you're the elementary teacher in a self-contained classroom and you're teaching all the subjects and you're doing ELD, or designated ELD, that language learning time, you can think to yourself, gosh, in math, we're doing comparison. So I'm going to, we're really working on greater than and less than. So I think I'm going to teach greater than and less than in my ELD time, because that will really help them in the math. Like as a teacher, I can go through that process. I think the challenge at the high school level is because each of the content areas are in their own self-contained classrooms, it's really hard for the ELD specialist to know what's going on and maybe like what would help in something like in their science classes, if kiddos are creating hypotheses, then maybe if-then construction might be really helpful to dig into in an ELD time. And so it becomes incumbent on the ELD specialist to go and talk to all of the content areas going, hey, what's going on in your classroom? Like, what are some, structures that I could possibly teach or support? And that's what we heard from the ELD specialists that we talked to and from the content area classrooms that we talked to going, I'm not really sure what it is that I need to be elevating, is what the content area teachers would say. And the ELD teachers were saying, hey, I can help them elevate. I just don't know what it is that they're teaching. And so finding opportunities to bring these folks together and leverage their respective levels of expertise in both content and language, I think is really important. And I think that, this becomes what we think of in the leadership world as an adaptive challenge. It's not just a technical challenge where you can find a quick fix to something. It's like taking that idea that, oh, we are all responsible for both the content and the language together. And so we're going to work in tandem, in community, together to make this happen. And then the technical challenges come up of like, okay, so when are we going to meet? When is our common planning time? When do we have an opportunity to, cross-pollinate some of these things? So I think that's the added challenge that I see in the secondary level.
Yeah, I completely agree with that perspective, Laura. I think size and scale at a secondary level is very, very different. And so the context that a secondary teacher is working in is very unique relative to an elementary setting. And I'm thinking about in LA County, our context where we've experienced, like the rest of California, declining enrollment. And so now typically in many of our LEAs see much smaller elementary schools. But depending on the composition of a district, the way that they have opted to structure themselves, we still see, in many cases, still some larger high schools. And so the coordination of facilitating some of that collaboration can be challenging in terms of considering what structures do you have in place when you have a very large staff. How do you create the time and space for people to come together and to, again, leverage that tremendous knowledge that they have and the expertise that they have to be able to engage in some collaborative planning to create these optimal environments for their students and their classrooms on a daily basis?
Well, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. So with the numbers you cited, I would guess that most teachers have at least one English learner in their classroom at a time, on most days. I don't know if that's true. Would that be about right?
It's very interesting. We see some, LEAs where they have 18, 20, sometimes perhaps a larger percentage of English learners. And then we see other LEAs where it's sort of a more low incidence type of student group within their context. But it would say that in many of our LEAs, yes, you would be hard pressed to find classrooms where there is not a current or former English learner.
Well, and I ask because, and again, I'm not the educator in the room, but it seems to me that a lot of these strategies in terms of teaching, while focused on English language learners, they also are just good teaching strategies, right? And can help all students. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is true. And that's often been an adage of what we used to call specially designed academic instruction in English is that, good teaching is good teaching. And that if you're doing it, the rising tide's going to raise all ships. And I think that there is I think that there's definitely some truth to that. I think that, one of my colleagues, Dr. Guadalupe Valdez, has often argued that there's something a little additionally special about working with English language learners. And I think that that's where the knowledge of the English language specialists or the coaches or the TOSAs come into play, as well as not only do you want to create these opportunities for interaction and output in your classrooms, which is going to be great for everybody, but there's the additional scaffolding for particular disciplinary language structures, syntax, things like that, that you might want to just keep an eye out or an ear out. And so to Roberta's point about sort of leveraging all of those pieces of expertise, I think is where the power will come. And, all of in LA County, all of those pieces are there. It's just getting, everybody to talk to each other in some ways.
Yeah, and Laura, if I just could add too, like it really does, speak to the sense of intentionality. I'll think back to my former principal lens where we would have these conversations about what is our daily ELD block going to look like? What's it going to consist of? How are we going to group students so that we're really providing leveled, targeted instruction? And there was often a conversation about how, yes, absolutely, several of the very high leverage strategies are going to be profoundly impactful for all students. But at the same time, just being very clear and intentional about that sense of, who it is we are really focused in on supporting during that particular, as we say in terms of designated ELD protected time. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and we are, though, as Laura mentioned, talking about just really good teaching combined with that sense of intentionality to support our English learners.
Mhm. I'm so glad that you brought up the intentionality. Roberta, it's one of my favorite words in thinking about how to be my most intentional self when it comes to teaching. And I think that, many times, and this was a finding from the paper actually, is that, when we talk to teachers, they said, we've gotten so much great professional development from the county on strategies for English language learners. And I'm so grateful for the things that I've learned. But what I think that I found, and this isn't specific to LA County, I think I found it across the state and other groups that I've worked with, is that what I hear teachers saying is, well, I'm not sure what to do with my English language learners. They're looking for the strategy. They're looking for the tip, the trick, the approach. I'm not sure what the activity is. And I think that that's not true. I think the data from this study would show that actually they know what to do. The question is how do I do it? How do I put this into practice? How do I put this into place? And I think that part of the response to that is exactly what Roberta's talking about, is this intentionality, is that there's not the one strategy or the one approach or the one activity that's going to make the big difference. It's really the whole, it's really rethinking my teaching in making opportunities accessible for students, both in terms of how I structure the input, how I support with sentence frames and visuals and gestures and word banks and stuff like that. But how do I structure the output so that kids have the opportunity to talk about what they know? And so with that, yeah, I could take any of the good strategies that I know for any of the classrooms that I teach, like four corners activities where I ask kids to go to a corner of the classroom depending on their opinion about some juicy topic and then discuss it. Well, I can take that activity and I can elevate it with the intentionality for my language learners. They might need a little bit more support around the language for it, but that's a great strategy that I don't think is kind of like EL specific. Right. So when teachers start saying, well, I've had a lot of great PD, and districts start saying, well, our English learners are still not performing at the levels, we must need more PD. I have to ask everybody to pump the brakes a little bit. Is the answer really more PD? Or is the answer more intentional time to implement what they've already learned in a PD? And I think the teachers were telling us they just need the time and the opportunities to collaborate with their colleagues.
I want to go to a term that's used in the paper, institutional theory. Hoping that you can give us a little bit more information about what the theory is and
Yep.
how it can support scalability and consistency.
Right. So institutional theory is just the idea of being, again, intentional and purposeful about embedding social structures, rules, norms, practices, routines, relationships into everyday operations. And by doing that, then you can start to scale up the things that are working and make them more consistent across time. So, for example, by and this is not a prescriptive way of approaching things. It's more of a descriptive approach, where if you've got an English language specialist, making sure that they know what their roles and responsibilities are. Some in the study said that that they saw themselves as compliance officers, making sure that the numbers of minutes were being met. Others said, yeah, I am just teaching my ELD courses, and the others yet said, well, what I really want to be doing is pushing into my colleagues' classes and doing some collaborative work. And I think that if site leaders can work to codify some of those relationships, like this is your role, these are your responsibilities, these are your relationships, these are the ways to work together, then it becomes a technical challenge of finding the time to work together. But then after that, they can start to get those relationships building and finding small successes as they go and then grow it out from there. So making sure that everybody knows what it is that they are kind of tasked to do. And it may sound very kind of simplistic to say that. Like I can imagine teachers saying, well, I know what my role is. But I think that this idea of like, everybody's a language teacher and maybe everybody's also a content teacher. And then if that's the case, then, okay, well, what pieces of the language am I responsible for? What pieces am I responsible for? How are we going to work together? And where are we going to find the time to do that? So we talk about establishing conducive learning environments where teachers can do that kind of work together. We talk about making sure that everybody's clear on what their roles or responsibilities are, and then finding the times to do that. I think one of our interviewees said, we used to have a lot of really great professional learning time. We'd have, what we would call PLCs, collaborative moments, and during sometimes like early release days and things like that. And I think what happens in those times is that teachers get tasked with other things. And that was another finding from the study as well, is that, even if they're given this time to do the kind of learning and collaboration that we would hope that they do and that they've been trained to do and that they are knowledgeable professionals in, often the responsibilities, all the other responsibilities of other things creep in, so that professional learning time got taken up with, I don't know, things like grading or responding to emails or, checking with, the nurse down the hall to see how things are. I mean, there are all kinds of things that happen that usurp teachers' time. And I think that if I have a professional crusade in my career, it's to make sure that teachers can get back to the thing that they're best at doing, and that's teaching and providing the time and the resources to be their best selves in the classroom, because they deserve it. They work so hard and they know what they're doing. They just need the time and the resources to do it.
I think it's interesting, Laura, talking about this sense that, teachers are working really hard. And I think it's similar for all of our administrators. Administrators are working really hard. Everybody's working.
Absolutely.
Think about kind of the limited bandwidth that any given professional has. When we think about the finite number of minutes in any given day, I think we're at a point where simply working harder just really isn't feasible. And I think we have to consider some perhaps different ways of considering our use of time. And so I think that, for example, as you mentioned, Laura, it's not about adding on perhaps additional professional development. But perhaps it's about considering our current use of time, be it early release days, other types of contexts where we're addressing professional learning and collaboration, and thinking about how we can perhaps fine-tune them. For example, in terms of professional development, one of the things that we hear from teachers across the content areas is that they feel like it's most beneficial when it's very specific and targeted to their particular content area. And so that's something that they very much appreciate. In addition, I think that, in terms of duration, perhaps long, extensive PD is just not something that's practical. But we've also heard from teachers just something that is brief. It can be a refresher, or it can introduce something new, but in a finite amount of time, where then there's an opportunity to practice a strategy, then to come back and reflect and share out with colleagues. All of that is very helpful. But I do think that the idea of simply adding on to our existing structures is not organizationally sustainable. And so I think the consideration of how we use our existing structures in perhaps more strategic ways is going to potentially be one route for improving things in the future.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned those things, Roberta, because those are a lot of our tenets in CSET when we in terms of professional development, is making sure that it's got a content focus, that it's got some active learning component for the participants, and that it's sustained over time. So I think that piece about like being able to try something out, collect the data, do the reflexive cycle in it, and like, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's go back and try something different. And also provide and having the opportunity to to try something that doesn't work and say, okay, I want to tweak it in this way. It's not, it's not the magic bullet. I can't just sort of drop it into my classroom and expect it to be perfect. I've got to work with it. And so finding the opportunities to find that that sustained practice over time, I think, is really important.
Before we wrap, I want to ask, what are the small steps that teachers and school sites can take to implement sustainable supports for both teachers and students in the classroom? Where do they get started?
I think that I think there are a couple of things, and Roberta mentioned a few of them at some point in our conversation. I think it's getting everybody on board to the collective goal of we all are language teachers and content teachers. And we're going to, orient ourselves in those directions. I think in order to do that, providing teachers with some collaborative time to do co-planning. I would advocate for co-teaching or lesson study, if at all possible. I know that co-teaching can be a very expensive model to implement, but if there are opportunities to do it in even short spurts, I think that would be really beneficial. I know lesson study can be very vulnerable for teachers, but if you've got a good buddy colleague who would say, hey, let's try this out. Would you watch me and I'll watch you? And we'll give each other feedback on that. That's that piece of implementation that I think that we're hearing is like, it's not that teachers don't know what to do. It's finding the opportunities to figure out how to do it. And something like lesson study and collaboration would be a part of that.
I would also add to that. I think all of that is essential. And then I would also add that I think establishing some group expectations about the delivery of comprehensive ELD on a daily basis for all English learners. I think developing an understanding that designated ELD is a requirement, something that can be so foundationally important for English learners. And then at the same time, being aware and facilitating, in some respects, a mindset shift with staff about the role of content teachers and how, integrated ELD is something that, again, is essential for students. And that, each day in our classrooms as teachers, how can we consider, really providing supports and scaffolds for students to access rigorous content. And so I think something as just basic as comprehensive ELD is critically important. In many respects, it's not that there is some silver bullet in terms of how to help English learners acquire English proficiency. It really just is about the daily high quality language supports that they're getting in classrooms. I mean, that's one of the elements that makes the most incredible difference for students.
I want to thank Laura and Roberta for joining us today. Thank you for breaking this information down. We also want to thank Sobrato Philanthropies and the Greater Los Angeles Education Foundation for supporting this paper. For more information, visit www.lacoe.edu. See you next time on Let Me Add to That.
Please follow the Los Angeles County Office of Education on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Los Angeles COE. That's Los Angeles COE. Or you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Los Angeles County Office of Education.